Coming up, the landback movement is quantified, and professors in Kansas are mapping the details. Plus, theft and allotments through Oklahoma's history. We also check in with a Native historian, Ned Blackhawk, who just won the National Book Award. We have those interviews ahead, plus headlines on the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The ICT Newscast is sponsored by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, a nonprofit organization serving American Indian nations and people in the recovery and control of their rightful homelands. On the web at iltf.org.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. We start in Maine, where Wabanaki tribal leaders are still bound by a 1980 federal law that limits their sovereignty. The 6 Wabanaki nations that predate the state are subject to jurisdiction and treated like municipalities. Federal Indian law enacted after 1980 that would affect the application of state law does not apply in Maine unless mandated by Congress. For example, Wabanaki nations had to lobby the state legislature and the governor to implement the tribal provisions of the 2013 Violence Against Women Act. It took them 6 years. Recently, more than 70% of voters supported a constitutional amendment that would require the state to print the treaty obligations for the Wabanaki Nation. It was removed from the state's constitution in 1875. This symbolic gesture would hopefully further tribal sovereignty, said an ambassador from the Penobscot Nation. On to northern Arizona, where rural communities can expect high-speed internet as soon as February. The Bridging the Digital Divide project is affordable broadband internet to people living in the Hualapai Nation and Mojave and La Paz counties. The 2250-mile construction project broke ground in Kingman earlier this month and will deliver internet to about 32,000 Arizonans. WeCom Fiber, a telecommunications company in Kingman, is heading the project and is awarded a total of $13.2 million from state and federal grants. Around 22% of people in rural communities and 20% of people on tribal lands lack broadband access. High-speed internet will be available to the Hualapai Nation starting in February, which will be a game changer for businesses, public safety operations, medical facilities, schools, and libraries. In Australia, Indigenous languages are facing extinction. The country, which once had 300 Indigenous languages, now have fewer than 30 remaining as primary spoken tongues. The Mirning language is in danger of completely disappearing, with no one learning it, according to the National Indigenous Television. Mirning representatives are attempting to reverse the trend with a project at the Goldfields Language Institute in southern Western Australia. That center's efforts are constrained, however, by funding and a focus on other geographical areas. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. All across the country, we hear news of tribal nations getting land back. Whether an outright purchase or a donation, the movement is gaining traction. A project at the University of Kansas is putting it on a map. An idea of MacArthur Fellow Sarah Deer and a fellow professor helped her create a website to quantify land back. Shirley Snavy and Stuart Huntington have this interview. Let's take a look.
The origins of it are probably 10 to 12 years ago. I had found a story about a Pennsylvania farmer who discovered that he was on stolen Delaware land and decided on his own accord to find a way to return that land to the Delaware tribe. The Delaware tribe's now in Oklahoma, so Pennsylvania has been a long time ago. And I was just touched by the story, that when we talk about land back, it's not a metaphor. It's actual land back. And as a private landowner, I found it very interesting that he would do that. And so I wondered if there were other private landowners that had some interest in donating or returning, I should say, the land to its rightful owners. And I came up with a list over time. Then I met Ward at the University of Kansas, shared the list with him, and he made a map.
In terms of the map, it's a collection of publicly available news links that started with the list that Sarah shared, and then I researched to find news stories that were already in circulation about instances of return of land, and used an ArcGIS web-based software that's publicly available to create the map and to provide links to the news stories and also to the tribe or nation or group page of the folks who had received the land.
Yeah, we're still just now getting the word out.
Okay.
And we hope that, with some publicity, that we can get some feedback from private landowners who have donated land or tribal nations themselves. And again, it's just trying to help people think about land back as a literal return of stolen land. And so we anticipate this to be a dynamic project that will be ongoing and regularly updated with new information that we come into, that we learn about.
We've had students involved at different points of time at different degrees. This project is one that, as Sarah mentioned, she shared the idea with me, and I've been working on it, but it's not an externally funded project or a grant. It's our time as academics, and there have been some students who've to date donated their time. I do anticipate that now that word is getting out, and even just from our own accumulation of news stories, we may have to change the platform that we're on a little bit, because the number of instances of land return or things that are close enough to land return to be included on the map is going beyond the software's capacity to host them. And so that will probably be a project that actually involves students a little more in trying to get them opportunities that can help them build their knowledge, but also build their careers.
I think there are probably ways to use this project in contexts that I haven't even thought of yet. It's primarily right now to educate, to give people a sense of what's happening, perhaps inspire other landowners who live on stolen land to be inspired by that and consider themselves where their land is and who it originally belonged to. I also think that it's, providing data for the land back movement as a whole, to say again that this is not just an aspiration or a metaphor, but it can actually happen. And then the third audience, I think, would be, other scholars and academics who may be writing about land back and can use this map to find specific data that's relevant to their own writing project. So it kind of depends on who's looking at it in terms of how the tool can be used.
Looking through the news or podcast or whatnot, then I think about the connections between, say, the Quapaw land in Oklahoma, where there were lead and zinc mines, and the connections then when you think about that lead and zinc went into so many of the bullets that have been used in wars around the wars of colonial conquest in the 20th century, and just the connections between how land has been used and misused and how it's being returned and what condition it's in. Because that's certainly one of the questions here is there capacity to manage the land well? Is the capacity remotely close to where the land is, right? Because we have here in Kansas lots of lineages with different tribes that this is not their ancestral homeland. So it goes to a very basic question of who is the land returned to? Again, this hopefully it helps the website and its evolution will help people think through different dimensions, legal, moral, ethical, relational, around these projects.
One of the links we have, because in addition to the map, if you continue to scroll down and are patient, you'll get a list of links. And some of those links inform the user as to the legal implications of the transfer of land and the complexity of the return because of questions of taxes and inheritance and trust land and all of those things, which we already know are super complicated in Indian country without land back. And so, we would, encourage anyone who is thinking about this kind of project to consult an Indian law attorney early on in the process.
The easiest way to find the map is to search KU landback. Right now, the priority is tracking private landowners and corporations returning land. State and federal land returns are not yet reflected on the map. A movie about the Osage Nation in Oklahoma brings to light allotments and oil money. Killers of the Flower Moon portrayed just a small part of the injustices that Native Americans faced in the early 1900s. However, the theft and deception hit many tribes, including the Muskogee. The Lucinda Hickory Research Institute paired up with the Verified News Network to shed light on the atrocities.
This is the side of Tulsa you have never seen before. The real stories of the atrocities committed against American Indians after their forced removal to Oklahoma. The land grabs, the legal assaults, the Indian boarding schools, and the suspicious, untimely deaths. As each elder dies, another story dies with them. Stealing Tulsa, an investigative series by VNN and LHRI, because some stories shouldn't stay buried.
My partnership with Brittany as the leading reporter on this project that we're working on, Stealing Delazi, which Delazi is Creek for Tulsa. She has been a good community partner in the fact that when something doesn't seem quite right, because it's really important to me to tell this story from an Indigenous point of view, a Creek point of view, and I have a lot of support from non-Native people. In history, we would call that friends of the Indian. I see that almost every day. And if you're a friend of the Indian, write to representative and say they're being mistreated. But when I express these concerns to Brittany, she's very open. She doesn't get upset, and she listens.
When I reached out to you, you had provided me with so much information about the allotment in particular, but really just kind of opened my eyes to allotment era research. And I was able to not only learn about this specific allotment that had been researching, but really introduced to Tatiana's family, to her work relating to Muskogee Creek people, to the Hickory family. And it was just such a wealth of untold information that I had asked Tatiana if she would be interested in, sharing her reporting and her work as far as a news series and reporting went. And she said that she would be interested, and so we started piecing the story together, and it evolved into a multi-episode series that came to be known as Stealing Tulsa.
We start talking about the Hickorys, about Lucinda Hickory. Lucinda Hickory was my great aunt. In the Tulsa World, April 27th, 1912, the Tulsa World reports, the Galbraith test on the Lucinda Hickory is complete. It gives the number, the township and all, and it's just southeast of Kendall College. It has tested for $20 million in gas, which of course is a lot of money for the city of Tulsa right at her front door. That part has always got me, and I don't understand the big world of how the city has to own the gas. but it started apparently a long time ago. So, with this said, after that article ran in the Tulsa World, Lucinda Hickory is dead 8 months later. And that, of course, is sad. And she was only 13 years old. But what made it bizarre for me was the general warranty deeds filed in Tulsa County Courthouse at exactly 5 p.m. the day of her death. That's a red flag. They don't give the parents time to grieve. And the documents were allegedly signed with an X and a thumbprint by Lucinda's parents who didn't speak, read, or write English. So I've thought a lot about that, and they either approached the grieving parents right there in the house and got their X and thumbprint, or took them to the county courthouse, or the documents are forged. And to me, any one of those are possible.
On this website, it introduces you to the series. All of our produced stories so far are available there. There's the first 6 stories that we have done. We do have some that are in progress. We have not only the long form articles that are available to read, we also have links to the YouTube videos for people to watch. As I said, that it right now is a 6-episode series. It has information about this tour that we were able to go on this summer, where we were able to travel to different research facilities across the country, 3 of which we were able to learn a lot more than what we had known before we left on them, as well as we were able to scan in a lot of documentation and evidence based research that we've not really even been able to touch the surface on right now. But we do also have some recaps on there as far as what the Stealing Tulsa Summer Tour was able to glean. We have resources that were provided by Tatiana as well, for people to be able to start researching their own family's allotment history. And then we, of course, have just a scaled down version of some of these mapped out locations of what um, the some of the landmarks in Tulsa are and who those original allottees were. One of the biggest ones is Dugabachi, who his allotment is where the where Gathering Place, the world renowned park in Tulsa, now sits. And so that is something that we had started, and Tatiana's been working for years to try to get recognition of this allotment history there at Gathering Place and other places around Tulsa, but has not happened to this date.
To Native people that have these stories of stolen land and mysterious deaths, you can find out more than you think. It only takes the oral history to get you started.
Stealing Tulsa is one of the many series Verified News is developing for Indigenous communities in Oklahoma. Yale historian Ned Blackhawk is envisioning American history through a new lens, putting Native people at the center of the narrative. This month, he won the prestigious National Book Award for his work, The Rediscovery of America. Stuart Huntington caught up with Professor Blackhawk at his office on the Yale campus.
I'm just thrilled beyond belief. And also last week at the National Book Awards, there was a major prize bestowed by Ojibwe author Hyde Erdrich to a Chamorro poetry finalist who won the National Book Award in poetry, Craig Santos Perez. So Craig and I constitute 40% of the recipients of the National Book Award last week. That's kind of a historic moment. There's a Native American judge, Hyde Erdrich. So there are also a lot of Indian peoples at the event. So it was really kind of revelatory experience that hopefully kind of signals that the publishing world, like contemporary Native American media in so many ways, is starting to get transformed by Native authors and writers.
Sir, I wonder if you would summarize your thesis in this book for our audience.
I'm happy to do so. My book is entitled The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. And it actually has a pretty simple thesis, which is you can't understand the history of the United States without its Native American and indigenous populations. The book has that kind of simple argumentative claim early on. It recognizes how indebted the project is to a generation or so of scholars who have all been working really diligently and effectively at rediscovering American history. That's where the title comes from. It makes another claim that in order to understand the centrality of Native Americans to U.S. history, we have to unmake the conventional paradigms that have often excluded or marginalized Native Americans. And so to do so, to give you some examples, I divide the book into two halves, part one and part two. And the first half of the book examines what I call part one, Indians and Empires, which is the centrality of indigenous peoples to the evolution of European imperial societies across North America. And it ends with a substantive chapter on the Revolution and then on the Constitution. And then part two opens essentially the second half of the book, which is another 6 chapters, which is generally titled Struggles for Sovereignty, where I locate the challenge of federal Indian affairs at the heart of the evolution of the 19th century American state. And so that second half starts roughly around the time of ratification of the Constitution in the late 1780s and goes to the present. And 4 out of those 6 chapters are largely about the 19th century world. So the 20th century receives 2 significant chapters that overview the kind of first half of the 20th century and the second half, using the Second World War as a primary demarcation. So in each of these sections, we could talk about the Civil War, we could talk about the evolution of the French Empire, we could talk about the Spanish settlement in the Southwest, the emergence of Indian activism in the early 20th century that bred the Society of American Indians, which pushed forward the American Indian Citizenship Act, which we'll be commemorating next year. In each of these areas, it's undeniable that Native Americans were central to the course of American history.
You call the Native Americans in California the first casualties of the Civil War.
Correct.
And you also talk about the Revolutionary War as being prompted by Native issues on the frontier.
Correct.
These are different ways of seeing what are the central parts of every high school American history course.
Right. And it is a big undertaking to rediscover American history. And I do say early on that it's going to take generations for this to kind of come into really full formation. And the claims about the Civil War are a little less kind of there's a little less causation there than in the Revolution. And so I just observe, based on the scholarship of other people, that the federal government starts funding California's state militias after the South secedes in 1860 and early 1861. So before the Battle of Bull Run, before really the major battles of the Civil War are unfolding, California state militias, which had previously been receiving state funding for their atrocities essentially against Native Americans or campaigns against them, now receive federal funds. And so why can't we think of these campaigns as part of the Civil War, since federal funding was at the heart of those initiatives? So that's just kind of one example, but it doesn't have the kind of causation. I'm not saying the Civil War started in California, although the incorporation of the West was the central feature of the causation of the war more broadly, as many would know. But I am saying in the Revolution chapter that the articulation of anti-Indigenous ideologies and ideas, which make it into the Declaration of Independence, the last grievance of the Declaration of Independence is against the King of England for inciting merciless Indian savages to attack our frontier inhabitants. And those terms, merciless Indian savages or frontier inhabitants, come from not Virginia, at least not Eastern Virginia, not the gentry classes that Jefferson and Washington were from, or Madison and Monroe as well. They're not coming from Boston, where Sam Adams and other kind of merchant leaders are operating busy seaport economies. Those are frontier concerns, and they're coming from the interior. And I spend a lot of time in that chapter kind of arguing that from the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which ends in 1763, to roughly the late 1760s, a very distinctive anti-Indigenous ideology has formed that is animating settler grievances against not just the crown, but Native Americans. And there are massacres and battles and other kind of forms of frontier rebellions, essentially. And I call them settler militias that are erupting across Pennsylvania and other backcountry regions throughout that fateful decade. but those have not been seen as central causes of the revolution. And so the subtitle of my chapter on the revolution is called The Indigenous Origins of the American Revolution.
Sir, that's fascinating. Thank you very much for your time today.
It's been really a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to Indian Country today.
ICT invites you to be part of something special. Each week, we're taking on a different topic important to Indigenous people and you, our viewers and readers. Find the link at ictnews.org to sign up for the e-weekly newsletter. It's emailed on Thursdays. We're covering food, business, economic development, arts, and culture. And for December, we're working on a very special holiday edition on the web at ictnews.org. And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.